Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today's reading is one that most of us have probably heard before. It's about great and wise King Solomon wisely adjudicating a conflict between two women arguing over a baby. Of course, if you think about it too closely, you begin to wonder just how wise was that? After all, he was betting the baby's life that the false mother would actually let the baby die if she couldn't have it, which few people would want a baby to die, even if they couldn't have it. But I guess the plan worked this time. I was texting with a non-church-going friend yesterday, and he asked what I was preaching on. I said what it was, and he sarcastically said, "How wholesome." And I said, well, at least it's better than David and Bathsheba from last week. And of course, this whole about trying to balance different concerns, I've been thinking about the survey that many of you participated in. In that survey, a large number of people said they wanted to have more traditional hymns. About the same number of people said they wanted more contemporary music. And I don't really know how the heck we're going to do that. I guess we could cut the worship service in half or something. I don't know. But to go back to what my friend said, wholesomeness sounds good, but is wholesomeness really what our faith is about? Now, last week we did hear that terrible tale from the reign of King David that involved murder, sexual assault, and cover-up. We learned about how Bathsheba, who had been the wife of Uriah, ended up being the wife of the king. And although the first son that they had together died, her son Solomon is now the one sitting on his father's throne. Now, some have joked that this is Bathsheba's revenge, because despite everything she went through, she becomes the queen mother with her son on the throne. And somehow Solomon leapfrogs over all of his older brothers to become king, and conveniently they all end up dead. Not sure how that happens, because he conveniently had nothing to do with it. But today we read about Solomon's wisdom. Now, what exactly is wisdom? Now, I did do a whole sermon series on it during the summer, and so I guess I don't really need to say anything more about it. Yeah, I figured. It's summertime. Who remembers what's going on in the summertime? Even I don't even always remember sometimes. But wisdom, the Hebrew word is chokmah, is a type of practical knowledge. The word wisdom can be used, it's a little different in English than it is in Hebrew, because in Hebrew you can use this word wisdom to refer to the skills of a master craftsman or the skills of someone with another vocation. So like navigation or fishing or politics. These are all types of wisdom. But when we think about wisdom, we're mostly thinking about what does it mean, the mastery of the craft of living. How to live well. So wisdom is to live well in that sense. So that could be seen as a kind of wholesomeness. Wisdom, living well. What happens if we look a little closer? Now our reading for today is divided into two parts, right? First, we hear about how Solomon got his great wisdom. God appears to him in a dream and asks him, "What do you want?" Boy, haven't you ever thought when you read this story, gosh, I wish God would appear to me in a dream and ask me what I want. But then again, I probably wouldn't be as wise in my asking as Solomon was. In fact, that's the other thing. Did Solomon really need wisdom? Because he already knew what he needed to ask for. Maybe he was already kind of wise even before he asked. But Solomon asks for wisdom, and God is greatly pleased that that's what he asked for, and God says, "I give it to you. No one else will be as wise as you." And the second part, we see Solomon using that great wisdom. Two women from the bottom rungs of society appear before him. Both claim the baby as their own. What did people have to do back before genetic testing, right? And Solomon uses this novel method to determine who the real mother is. Again, not particularly wholesome in that respect. So what is the takeaway for us today in this text? Well, first of all, what is it not to take away here? We're not going to be asked to determine the parentage of a baby. And if we were, we certainly would not opt to cut the baby in half as a solution. Besides, too many people know that plot line now. It's not going to work. But one thing that we can see in this text that is important is a special concern for the most vulnerable. The scriptures tell us that Solomon was this great and powerful king filled with wealth and power. His dominion's vast empire that he ruled. And yet, here he is adjudicating a dispute between two lowly women. Is this the kind of thing you would expect a great king to be deciding? They were prostitutes, which is something women often had to take on in the ancient world, and some still do today. And it is just the two of them living together. Notice they have no family except for this baby. And Solomon hears their case just as if it were a big case between two rich landowners. Now, how can we take that message to heart? How can we take that concern for the most vulnerable? Can people consider that wholesome? To be that open to people at the bottom rungs of society? Would it be considered wholesome to expose yourself to the vulnerable? To be open to them, to care for them, and to take their concerns into serious consideration? And who are the vulnerable in our day and age? There's a lot of people claiming to be vulnerable, but who are the real vulnerable people? And do we even know any of them personally? But another important point that we have here is kind of the obvious one, is seeking wisdom, right? When Solomon was approached by God and God asked him what he wanted, Solomon asked for a discerning mind. He didn't ask for riches, he didn't ask for revenge, he didn't ask for power. He saw what was most important as a ruler, to be wise in order to care for your people. Oh, for wise leaders, wouldn't that be nice? And that can be seen as very wholesome, as long as we realize that it doesn't neatly line up with our values of our society. See, too often society's views are what is considered wholesome. And we can, each one of us, pray to God for wisdom, and we can learn from the wise people around us. And they didn't think about this at the time, but we can even learn about wisdom from complete idiots, right? What is that nice little bumper sticker that says, "Have you ever wondered if the point of your life is to teach other people what not to do?" Yes, we can learn wisdom from those people too, what not to do. But there is another side to Solomon that this particular text doesn't quite get at. But as you read further in 1 Kings, you realize there's a darker side to Solomon. One of the commentators I was listening to on a podcast pointed out that Solomon was really wise with regards to others, but not so much with himself. That might be something we can all relate to. It's much easier to give other people good advice than to follow your own good advice, isn't it? It's so much easier to see what someone else's problems are rather than your own. And that seemed to be Solomon's problem. Because in the end, things don't turn out well for Solomon. He ends up becoming the kind of king that the prophet Samuel warned the people about several chapters back. Solomon conscripts men into his army so that he can conquer surrounding territories. Solomon institutes forced labor for his massive building projects. And of course, he levied high taxes to pay for all of it. In the end, he was so repressive and he even built temples to foreign gods, which is, of course, a big no-no. And he was so oppressive, though, that when he died, the kingdom literally fell apart because of how he ruled it. So despite that auspicious beginning, he couldn't be wise enough when it came to himself. And in that is a warning for all of us, because Solomon prioritized his own needs, his own desires, over the well-being of his people, which a ruler should never do. So we always need to be watching over ourselves. Am I being wise and acting for good? Or am I just fooling myself to get something I want? And that is something I'm sure we can all relate to as we justify something that we really want. Oh, if I get those new pair of shoes, I can blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, no, it's not really about that good stuff. It's really just you want the shoes. Or if I get that new car, or if I get that new house. Well, I guess you could say you're driving the economy, right? Is that a good thing, right? To drive the economy? Helping consumption? Well, actually, too much consumption is a bad thing. Talk to economists, they'll tell you about inflation, but, I distract myself here. But we're really good at justifying what we want. And it isn't always the right thing or what's good for the whole. This is a familiar story, this story of Solomon and the two mothers. And on its surface, it is certainly not a wholesome story. In fact, I can imagine some of you going into work on tomorrow and, oh, what did your preacher preach about yesterday? Well, most of you will say, I don't remember. But some of you will say, oh gosh, was that story about Solomon cutting a baby in half? And they'll be like, oh, that's wholesome. And you'll be like, at least it's better than David and Bathsheba. But it is a story that speaks to us today because it reminds us of the importance to seek wisdom, that discerning mind, knowing the difference between right and wrong in the right time. It also calls on us to care for the most vulnerable. But it also is a reminder to us to watch ourselves. Don't just be wise when it comes to other people, but be wise when it comes to yourself. Realize, am I doing this because it's the right thing to do, or am I doing this just because I want it? Because even Solomon got messed up by that one.